this is what we're presenting here. Hopefully, has everybody gone to Rico's teachings? Yes. Excellent. So basically, half this you're already going to know, okay? This is actually really nice. This is actually really nice for me because this is a 12-hour series that I did. It's called The Gospel of the Suffering Servant. And so I'm going to give you guys just kind of a glimpse. Okay, so what I want you guys all to do, though, is promise me that if there's anything that I say that's sits wrong with you, that you don't quite understand, that maybe you may think there's something wrong with what I'm thinking, please come and talk to me about it, because what I'm going to do here is I'm going to present something that probably you guys have never considered, because most of us have grown up in the Western culture, and what have we learned about that recently? It's not the biblical culture, right? There's a lot of things that are very different. And we in the Western mindset, a lot of times, we think that the whole world thinks like us, right? We're like, well, what are those barbarians over there in the Middle East doing? You know, well, why are they doing this? Why are they doing that? But the reality is that that's how 70% of the world lives their life, is in an honor and shame culture. We have simply beaten it out of our society. We've trained ourselves out of this mindset, and unfortunately what happens is we get disconnected with the scriptures. Just like when the family breaks apart, we get disconnected with the scriptures. Like when we stop being an agricultural society, we get disconnected with the scriptures. And so there's a lot of things that we just don't catch in the scriptures. And we think we know what it means, but there's some differences here. So to begin with, this is just a small list of resources. Please, if you want to, email me for my complete list. There's probably about 150 books and articles that went into this, so I'm not going to go through all of that. All of this PowerPoint that you're going to see here, and all my PowerPoints are available on my website, rootedintorah.com, and you don't even have to be a member to get the access to all the PowerPoints and stuff. So you can go in and you can verify everything that I'm talking today, and I'll give you references to all the resources and stuff on the website. So what I want to start out with talking about today is, can we defend our faith in Yeshua? Can we? How many of you know someone who's left Messianic world, Hebrew roots, to go to Judaism? There's a lot of hands in here, right? How is that? Why are we not able to? Or why are people leaking into Judaism? Why are they denying our faith in Yeshua? Is it possible that what we've been trained for the past 2,000 years in the system of Christianity, and especially in the past probably 200 years, has really kind of lost the cultural essence there? There's a lot of questions, right? One of the things, we get onto what Brad Scott likes to call the knowledge, or the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, i.e. the internet. And what happens as soon as you get on the internet? You start interacting with people of other faiths and crazy beliefs and stuff. They're going to start challenging you. They're going to start asking you questions that maybe you don't know how to answer. Like, if Yeshua died as a sacrifice for your sins, why did God never accept human sacrifice? Show me where substitution is allowed in the Torah. Show me where you can have a sacrifice outside the altar in Jerusalem. These are the questions that we're facing now. Are we able to defend this? Are we able to look at Yeshua from perhaps a different perspective? As Rico mentioned yesterday, I presented this teaching in Jerusalem, and there was a Jewish fellow, and it's not like he converted and came up and did the sinner's prayer or anything like that afterwards. But when it was done, he said, "This is a much better understanding for how I understand things of this." So I'm going to present Yeshua in a different way. And please don't think I'm trying to minimize anything with Yeshua. Everything I've researched has only brought me closer to believing Yeshua is the Messiah. I don't understand him in the same way I did when I was back in the Adventist church, but I can firmly tell you that if Yeshua is not the Messiah, then we might as well just go out and start partying and living our lives and doing drugs and everything else, because there's no other reason. He's the entrance into the kingdom, but how did he do it? Let me read you something interesting. This is a verse that caught me off guard when I read it. This is in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. We go there, and it seems like there's this argument within the believers that there's no resurrection of the dead. And of course, we know historically this is a Sadducean belief. By the way, how many of you know how many people in the first century believed in the resurrection of the dead? Only certain sects within Judaism. All the pagans, everyone coming into the faith, they never had heard of resurrection of the dead. They believed in basically going on to the afterlife. How do you get into the afterlife? You live an honorable life. If you die an honorable death, you get to go to the afterlife. It's the same thing in Islamic culture today. Why do they go out and blow themselves up? Because they believe that that's a form of worship to their God. They believe that that brings them an honorable death. And if they die blowing themselves up, they might get to go to paradise and get a 72-year-old virgin. That's apparently what they're after. I don't know. But I don't know if you guys saw this in the news. There was a couple Kurdish women who picked up rifles and started shooting back at ISIS. What did ISIS do? They ran for their lives. Because if a woman kills them, that's a dishonorable death. And they don't get, right? And here's the thing. What is our government doing, though? We're trying to honor their culture and yet militarily defeat them. We're spending billions of dollars a year in a war that we're not trying to win because we're not recognizing them culturally. Do you know how we won World War II, by the way? There was a book, I don't remember the lady's name, it's called Chrysanthemum and the Sword, and she was commissioned by the U.S. government to study the Japanese culture. And she has a lot of good stuff on honor and shame, and she basically points out that the only way to defeat them, because they were weaker than us militarily, and yet they would fight to the death, they were just crazy good fighters. The way to defeat them was to shame them. So that's why they chose to drop those bombs, to force their God King to admit defeat, and when he did that on public television, demoralized all of them because they saw themselves as shameful after that. So, this is 1 Corinthians in chapter 15, verse 13. If there is no resurrection of the dead, then not even Messiah has been raised. And if Messiah has not been raised, then our preaching is in vain. Your faith is also in vain. Moreover, we've been found to be false witnesses of God, because we testified against God that he raised Messiah, whom he did not raise, if in fact the dead are not raised. For if the dead are not raised, not even Messiah is raised. And if Messiah has not been raised, your faith is worthless. You're still in your sins. That's something different. We've been traditionally raised to say he died, and it was his death that forgave our sins. And yet Paul right there was just saying it's his resurrection that's for our sins. So that's something very interesting to take into consideration. How did the disciples understand the work of Yeshua? Right? We need to go back to that first century mindset and really study the scriptures for what they say. You look at the early believers throughout Acts, there's like 15 times. They always say, Yeshua, whom you killed, speaking to humanity, and whom God raised from the dead. See, God's work was to raise him from the dead. We are the ones who killed him. And we're going to see all of that playing out here in Isaiah 53. Okay, once again, going back to the sacrifices. This right here, how many hours did I spend studying sacrifices?
1,000 hours.
1,000 hours. That's been I love studying the sacrificial system. And it's what I've found out is completely different. Yet, after 1,000 hours, I never stopped and I looked at a map. This fixed in my mind and helped me understand things so much better, okay? We hear all the time, if you commit a sin, in Leviticus, if you sin, what do you have to do? You have to bring a sacrifice for sin. Okay, excellent. Well, if I live in Jerusalem, that's all. Well, what if I live in Galilee? Every time I commit a sin, I've got to go to Jerusalem, okay? Sounds good? 7-day journey when you're traveling with animals and everything. How many of you have 7 days to travel to Jerusalem and travel back home? So 14 days, 2 weeks, every time you sin. No, that's pretty rough, right? Especially if you're poor. Most of them were impoverished. Most of them were slaves. But it's probably doable. You probably, kind of collect your sin. This is my sinning weekend. I'm going to get all my sins out of the way. We'll go to Jerusalem, and then I'm going to wait, a couple months before I sin again. Got to plan it out, right? Okay, we had a large group of believers here in Antioch, though. How far does it take to travel from Antioch? 3 weeks. How many of you have 6 weeks every time you sin to travel to Jerusalem? No. But there wasn't that many believers there. There was 2 million believers in the land, 2 million Jews in the land. There are 5 million Jews in diaspora. Most of them were in Alexandria and Babylon. How long would it take you to travel from Babylon? We read in Ezra and Josephus, it would take, my graphic disappeared. It would take 4 months, and you'd have to travel in a band of between 10,000 and 50,000 people. How many of you have 8 months to take off of work every time you sin? Maybe they understood atonement differently. Maybe they understood forgiveness of sin differently. We've read, of course, in the book of Hebrews, without the shedding of blood, there's no forgiveness of sins, right? Everyone familiar with that verse? Okay, we've all read that. And yet, how could they do that? How could they get forgiveness of sins if they lived there? How could the Ninevites have got forgiveness of sins without blood? How could Daniel have gotten the forgiveness of sins without the shedding of blood? In Babylon. Maybe we need to look at that scripture. How many of you agree? Maybe we should look at Hebrews 9 and see what it says. Okay? So when we look at Hebrews 9, we don't have, I probably believe it was written in Hebrew, because if you're writing in Hebrews, you're either writing in Hebrew or Aramaic, but we don't have any copies of that, so it's a completely pointless argument. We do have the Greek, though. And what's really cool about the Greek is using modern-day software, we can take that Greek word, and I can find every single place that that word appears in the Septuagint. The Septuagint is the Greek translation that occurred, that he translated approximately 300 BC. So I can find the Hebrew equivalent word. Everybody on board with this now? So now let's look at this verse here. It says, according to the law, almost all things are cleansed with blood. I absolutely agree. That's exactly what Hebrews said. But without the shedding of blood, there's no forgiveness. Well, we already talked about all these examples. So what's going on here? The interesting thing is if you go and you look at this Greek word here, the word there is aphesis. And you take that word into the Septuagint. Some of you probably who know a little bit of Hebrew can start to read what this says. About 33% of the time, it's from our word yovel. Dror, the release of slaves. Everybody know what yovel is? The Jubilee, the 50th year. Shemitah. It's also afik, which is a stream bed or a barrel of bones. We're going to go ahead and throw that one out because we don't think that without the shedding of blood, there's no barrel of bones. And then all these, even Azazel. Not once is it translated from salah or nasa, which are the two primary terms for forgiveness in the Torah. So now I can agree with this. Let's, instead of saying without the shedding of blood, there's no forgiveness, let's say there's no year of remission. When was the Jubilee declared? Every 50th year. On what day of the year, though? Yom Kippur. On Yom Kippur. Without the shedding of blood on Yom Kippur, the book of Hebrews, what day is it written in? Context of the date. It's written in the context of the day of Yom Kippur. If we don't understand it as that perspective, we're going to misunderstand this scripture. Now, in the first century, when we look at that map, how did they all participate in the sacrificial system? Those ones in Babylon, each year, someone from that community, they would send their half shekel to the temple. And that half shekel was then thrown into a big room, basically, and they would mix it all up, and then they would randomly select money out to pay for the sacrifices. So by paying your half shekel, you were paying in, and you were being part of Yom Kippur, and so national forgiveness is there. And so the book of Hebrews is written in the context of, hey, guys, the sacrifices are about to end. Yom Kippur is about to end. For national forgiveness, now we have Yeshua. We all think in an individual mindset, right? We're very individualistic in the United States. They thought in a national mindset. That's why it was Caiaphas, I believe, who prophesied that Yeshua would die for the what? The nation, the whole nation, national remission of sin, National Wiping Clean. Now everything for me makes sense. Okay, so with that in mind, what I did in this 12-hour teaching is I broke it down into 5 different parts. I started with honor and shame, did justice and righteousness, the patronage system, and also leprosy. And we'll talk a little bit about each of those subjects. I'm going to spend a little bit more time on honor, and then we're going to get into Isaiah 53. Okay, because it's very necessary for us to get the background, because when we read Isaiah 53, we're going to see that the language is different from what the church system has traditionally taught us. It says, to be honorable there was to be generous, brave, productive, the father of respectful sons and chaste daughters. One's honor was a valuable asset. It elevated a man in the eyes of his peers, enhanced his children's marriage perspectives, reassured allies and vassals, awed enemies, and aided in commercial dealings. If you had no honor, guess what you had? No business dealings, no ability to marry off your daughter. You were shunned from society. As sick as it is what Islam does, I understand how their society does honor killings. Because if a young lady is raped, they lose all of this. Their other children will never be married. No one wants to do business with them. They're shunned from society and their entire family dies. Once again, this is a completely messed up system, but this is why they do it. And how are we to ever reach out to them if we can't understand why they do something? Instead of calling them backward savages, let's understand what they are and show them how our King says, this is how you restore honor. What does it say in the Torah if a young woman's raped? It says she must marry the rapist, and we're all like, I don't want to do that, right? That's a very hard commandment for us, and so a lot of us just say, well, I'm not going to keep that one. Why do they do that in the Torah? Have you ever considered what was going on there? If a young woman in that society was raped, she was shamed, and it brought into question any lineage that came forth from her because she could no longer prove her virginity, and so no one wanted to marry her. And so the options were either her dad supports her for the rest of her life, or if he didn't have the money, she would become a barmaid, a prostitute, or something like that. She would live a horribly shameful life. Would it be better for her to live in that utter shame and have to become a prostitute or whatever else, as long as that rapist paid the penalty? Or does the Torah restore what honor she can have and say, guess what? Now you have to marry her. Now you can't divorce her. See, we think in the Western culture, we think about, where's my pound of flesh? I want to get retribution for what's done. Our King wants restoration, not retribution. And so all of these commands in the Torah are about restoration. Sometimes someone does have to be put to death because there's a need to restore shalom to the community, because you can't have people out there murdering other people. But in some of these other cases, they're thinking about the victim. When they're a victim of a murder, that person's already dead, but a victim of a rape, they're living in shame and dishonor. And so this is a way to elevate them, to raise them up, to restore them. Guess what they would do in the Code of Hammurabi, by the way? If a young woman was raped, her father then would have the right to rape the wife of the rapist. Do you see the justice of our King? Can you imagine living in a society where they would allow such things? And the Code of Hammurabi wasn't just some little, nothing code. This was studied for over 1,000 years. This was studied in Egypt. This code was written around 1800 BC. This was about contemporary with Abraham. 1,000 years people were studying a code that allowed rape of a rapist's wife. This is the conceptual sphere of kavod. We'll kind of skip over that. Honor competition, okay? We've talked about honor. Within every group, there's honor competition, and then between groups, there's honor competition, right? How many of you ever remember in high school, there would be like one ethnic group there, and they'd be fighting with each other. Well, someone of another ethnic group, they go over there, and they start to pick on something. Guess what happens? Boom, all of, those people who are ready to rip each other's heads off, suddenly they're attacking. Why? Because you just attacked the clan honor or the family honor, right? So there's competition within a family, within a clan, within a tribe, even within a nation. But then there's also competition between outsiders. And what's most important with this is there's competition between the gods, even our God. Now we say, well, wait a minute, there's no other gods. Why is he competing? We've got to understand that what is honor? Honor is in the public arena. It's essentially public opinion. So if the public believes there's other gods, guess what our God has to do? He has to compete with the other gods. And this is going on in the world today. How many of you remember there was an article probably a year or two ago in the news, and they had captured this Palestinian prisoner, and they go up to the guy and they ask him in this interview, and they say, you guys shoot thousands of rockets at us. Why can't you hit us? And he said to the news reporter, our aim is true. Your God is changing the direction of our rockets mid-flight. It is an honor competition between Yahweh and Allah. That's what's going on in the world today. And guess what? That's what was going on in the world back then. And so if there's an honor competition, who do we want to be the most honorable? Our God. Because why? How are we ever going to convince the nations to believe and to follow the Torah of our God if we act shamefully? If they see us as being shameful, they see our God as being shameful. You can read right here, it says, the good name of a family or patron, we could add into that the family deity, depends on the good behavior of all the subjects. Paul quotes this principle in Romans 2, I believe it's verse 25. He says, you who boast in the law, through your breaking of the law, do you not bring shame to God? Because it's through your breaking law that the nations see this, right? And so that's a very powerful message to me, and hopefully to you, is that what I do isn't just about what I do anymore. Because how can the atheists out there, how can the Muslims, how can everyone else in the world, how do they view our God? Can they see him? Do they want to read his word? No. They know our God through how I act. They know our God through how you act. And so, as we've been talking about this weekend, when we act hateful towards our brother, when we're about fighting an argument, and I've talked to people who've seen this, and they say, in fact, I have a family member who says, why would I want to believe in that God? After seeing the actions of another believer. That's what we are, that's what our mandate is to show the world the honor of our King, and it's through our actions. And so you see when Israel comes out of Egypt, they sing in Exodus 15, right? Mika mocha ba'alim Adonai. Who is like you, O Lord, among the gods? Do they believe in other gods? They may be dead, but regardless, they were ascribing honor to Yahweh. Whether or not there are other gods, they were ascribing that. And then you see that when they get to Canaan, Rechab sees and says, I've seen what your God has done. I've seen the honor of your God. I want to follow him because he has the power and the might. You notice that when he judged Egypt, he didn't go and say, you've done this, 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 and this wrong, did he? No, he said, let me show you who I am, and attacked them with plagues. The more power you have, the more honor you have. Shame, this concept of shame, a lot of times we hear it, and because we don't live in that culture, we don't realize shame is actually a good thing. It's a means of social control. Is it shameful for a woman to be walking around naked? Yes. So is that a good thing? Yes. Is it a shameful thing to commit adultery? Yes. So even in our society, we have a little bit of a concept, and realize that with this guilt and this shame and guilt societies, they overlap, right? We do have shame and honor, but we're not primarily driven by that. We are primarily driven by, are you guilty? Did I do something wrong? Whereas they are driven by the fear of rejection, physical rejection, abandonment, expulsion. You notice a lot of times in the Torah it says what? It says if he does this, you expel him from the camp. Cut off, karat. Expulsion was one of the biggest ways of controlling people's behavior. Oops. Shaming sanctions, all right? You have judicial shaming. So remember the Levirate marriage, the one where if you die and you never produce a son with your widow, now your brother-in-law has to marry her, and we're all like, I hope that my brother never dies, because man, I don't want to have to fulfill that mitzvot. Right? We're all Torah observant. How many of you would marry your brother's widow? Well, if you choose not to, you go through this ritual, and probably a lot of you have read it and go, well, go ahead, spit in my eye and take my sandal. I'd rather have that happen to me. All right, you can call me the house of him whose shoe was removed. But to them, that was very powerful. That was an extremely powerful sanction because that brought shame on his household if he did that. And you got to realize, if he refused to marry his brother's widow, guess what happens? He now gets a higher inheritance. Let's say there's two brothers. When the one died, or when the father died, they were going to split the inheritance 50-50. Well, now the brother A dies without a child, guess what? All that inheritance goes to the other brother. So this is a problem with greed here. And so this is preventing greed. They're saying, no, you raise up a child for your brother so that that child can receive your brother's inheritance. Even the water ritual, right? The adulterous bride. We read about that, and that seems like another kind of strange ritual. You're like, how could the husband and wife ever have a loving relationship after he accuses her of adultery and takes her there and strips her upper half off? How can that happen? It's interesting, and I propose to you that ritual wasn't about him feeling jealous necessarily. It was about a rumor going around town that she's faithful, and it's the way for the family to restore their honor, to show the entire community that she is a virtuous woman. I want to talk crucifixion. Crucifixion wasn't something invented just for Yeshua. Crucifixion wasn't something that the Romans used exclusively. We remember the Maccabees, right? After the Maccabean revolt, they set up what was called the Hasmonean dynasty, where they became kings and priests. And you get a little bit ways into it, and you get this fellow called Alexander Janus. Well, Alexander Janus was a Sadducee, and the Pharisees were very upset that he was both king and priest, and so they led a revolt. In fact, they actually sided with the Seleucid Empire, which is where Antiochus Epiphanes comes from. And after they were defeated, after the war's been going on for a while, the Pharisees, they decided, well, we'd rather be under Sadducean rule than Seleucid rule, and so they switched sides, and they eventually defeated the Seleucid Empire. But guess what Alexander Janus was? He wasn't very forgiving. He took 5,000 Pharisees, crucified them, lined them up along the walls of Jerusalem, and as they're hanging there on crosses, he had their families brought out and cut their throats in front of them. Little historical background. Now you understand why the Sadducees and the Pharisees hated each other so much in Yeshua's day? Can you imagine that being their history? Crucifixion has been used throughout history as a means of the worst type of death, because you're dying a shameful death. We could go into it. We don't have time. There's just everything about crucifixion. A Roman citizen was not allowed to be crucified. Paul could never have been crucified because it's too shameful for a Roman citizen to be crucified. And yet our Messiah was crucified. Do you know why they crucified? Why didn't they just stab him in the back? Because that would have been basically a more honorable death. Crucifixion was the most shameful death, and you notice what happened to his disciples afterwards. They dispersed. They were very ashamed. Peter didn't even want to talk about that was his master. They were so ashamed of what was going on. The crucifixion was a means of destroying not just Yeshua, but all of his followers. Had God not resurrected him from the dead, we probably would have never even heard of Yeshua, because no one would have wanted to talk about him. Political shaming. You notice, you see in Joshua, they go and they take all the captives, they put their foot on their neck, right? Yeshua's also said, later in 1 Corinthians 15, it says, he must reign until he puts all enemies under his feet. The feet are something shameful. The head is something honorable. And then, of course, you have informal social shaming. This is why you see all this stuff going on. Does anyone remember when Yeshua says, if someone slaps you on the right cheek, why the right cheek? So if someone strikes you. Most people, it's honorable to be right-handed. Let's just face that. I do apologize if you're left-handed, but the Bible considers me to be more honorable. If I'm right-handed and I'm going to strike Rico on the right cheek, would you mind coming up here for a second? I just want to show. Come on. This is important because every time you see it, it's the right cheek. In fact, if you go to the Didache, it also says the right cheek. If I'm going to strike you on the right cheek, boom, it's a backhand. Thank you. It's a backhand. And if you go to the Mishnah, I believe it's Baba Kama 8.6, it says that if you strike someone with a backhand, there's a penalty. Because it's not talking about getting into defending yourself in a fight. He's talking about defending yourself against an honor insult. That's what Yeshua was saying. He didn't say, because later on he tells his disciples, go buy some swords and defend yourselves. Right? So he's not a pacifist. He's just saying, don't get into these honor competitions. If someone assaults your honor, let God worry about your honor. Amen? All right. So within this, we have two basic patterns, guilt and reconciliation. This is the one that we've all been accustomed to. We call this teshuvah a lot of the time, right? Return. So someone's given favor, they transgress, there's abandonment, right? Israel was abandoned by God. And then there's some sort of reparation, and they return back to point A. All right, we're all familiar with this way of thinking. But there's another pattern that we see in Scripture. You see, Joseph did not go through this. Job did not go through this. What did it say about Job? After all of that abandonment, did he just return to point A? No, it says he had more wealth, more children, more everything. Right? So there's a separate pattern that we see through Scripture, and this is what's called challenge and honor. And a lot of us have probably seen this go on in our lives. We're given some sort of initial favor. Joseph was given this coat of many colors, which if we go back to the cultural context, we know that that's a coat that implies that he's going to be the head of the household. And then there's crisis, there's abandonment. Jonah cries out from the belly of the whale, why, where are you? Yeshua, what did he say on the cross? Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, my God, why have you forsaken me? He's going through divine abandonment. But then something happens and there's a reversal. And when this is reversed, they don't go back to point A. Job didn't go back to point A. Joseph didn't go back to being the head of the household. Joseph went back to being the head of a nation, second only to Pharaoh. Let me ask you a question. Did Yeshua return back to point A? No. Regardless, we can argue till we're blue in the face what his position was in the heavenly realm before he came to earth, but the reality is we have no idea. And because honor is public opinion, he didn't have the same honor in public opinion because we didn't know about him. But it says, in Philippians 2, it says that he was, for this reason, God raised him to the right hand, right? He's given a name above all names. He's raised to this new honor status. So this, what we normally think of, in reality, Yeshua went through this other pattern, which fits the pattern of honor and shame better. Now, what's interesting is we compare these. Pattern one is what I would like to call suffering with a cause. You did something wrong, you pay the penalty, right? This is where sin and atonement and the chatat, the what's called the sin sacrifice, it's probably not the best translation of the word, but that's for another day. You sinned, you messed up, you make reparation, you return to point A. That's what we've all seen. That's where sin and atonement, crime fall in. But this other pattern over here is what's called redemption, exaltation, remission of sin, right? You notice Israel, let's go back through this here. Israel, or the sons of Israel, they received favor from God. God gave the covenant, the promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, right? They had initial favor, but then what happened? Crisis. They went down to Egypt, and Pharaoh no longer acknowledged Joseph. And so they were abandoned, they were in slavery, and yet that was reversed. We know the story. And when they came out, were they the same as they were before? No, they were a mighty nation. They were powerful, and they actually received the land. Instead of just one little cave, they got the entire land. Well, it took them a while to get it, but so we see that pattern. And so, when we see the work of Yeshua, we're going to see this. By the way, how many of you know how many times the word atonement appears in your New Testament? I didn't know this. I had to look it up. And I found it actually doesn't appear once. Now, in your English, you'll find it probably 3 to 4 times, depending on your translation, but it will be the sacrifice of atonement. And if you take that Greek word and translate it back, it's not found in Leviticus in that context of those sacrifices. Now, what does Yeshua talk about? He talks about redemption. How many of you ever studied the difference between redemption and atonement? Yeshua was the greater sacrifice I'm going to propose to you. He did something more than just on an individual level. He did something that no sacrifice could ever do. These sacrifices, they just returned us to here. When we receive our forgiveness in the kingdom, do we go back to point A? No. It says we're going to receive new garments. Rico talked about this. What do new garments mean? New honor, new status, new names. Every time you see the name, don't think about pronunciation. It's about the honor, the authority, the reputation. That's what, it drives me nuts when people are saying, the only way to be saved is if you pronounce the name correctly. Really? Have you ever learned Hebrew? No. Ever remember that little episode where there was these 7 sons of Sceva, and they were trying to cast out the demon? And they said, in Yeshua's name, what happened to them? They got jumped on. Do you think they knew how to pronounce Yeshua's name correctly? I bet they had every syllable, every accent perfect. It did not work. That's what's called magic. Pronunciation correctly is magic. That doesn't mean we shouldn't strive to pronounce his name correctly, because that's something honorable. But to say that we can make him do something for us if we pronounce his name correctly is magic. Talked about all of this. I want to move into patronage. Rico talked about this, and this is really interesting. Remember the circle of grace from yesterday, right? What I forgot to mention when I was talking about that is that the circle of grace, guess what happens if you choose not to reciprocate? The circle is broken. They understood that. And if you broke the circle, that brings shame to your name, and no one wants to make you their client. And so when Paul and the other disciples, when they're writing and saying you've been given grace, the implication there that everyone in that culture understood that is, if you're given grace and you don't respond, that grace is meaningless. That we do have a duty to respond with public honor. That's what's so great here. We got a whole stage, a band. That's what we're doing up there, is we're giving honor to our King. Loyalty, right? We ISIS is out there. And, those Christians out there, they don't know the name. They don't keep the Torah in the same way that we do. They don't keep the feast. They keep Sunday. They probably keep Christmas and Easter, but guess what they are? They're loyal. Because that jizya tax, that submission to the system of Islam, and that submission to the God of Islam. And they say, I would rather die than submit to you. And that puts me to shame. I don't know, that for me, that would be hard. I just pray that when that time comes, the Father gives me the loyalty to say, I don't care what you do. Because guess what? Where's our hope? Our hope is in the resurrection. You want to know one of the reasons why Christianity spread is because they knew God could resurrect. No matter what the emperor could do, whatever Caesar would do to you, whatever the U.S. government will do to you, whatever FEMA and the aliens coming through the CERN reactor, whatever they do to you guys, our God is more powerful than aliens. Our God will resurrect us from the dead, and he's proven his honor, his ability to resurrect through Yeshua. So I don't even have to worry if I'm the only one killed, because guess what? He's going to take care of my family. Why do I have to, what do I have to be afraid of? Providing gifts and services. This is what the sacrifices were about. This is what keeping the Torah is about. It's the proper response to grace. Righteousness and justice. How many of you have heard some teachings on righteousness and justice? This, if you haven't, please find someone. Eddie teaches it, Rico teaches, I teach it, Daniel teaches it. I know there's other teachers out there who teach it. This is one of the most important subjects, one of the most important subjects in the Bible, because this is what our mandate is. In fact, in Psalms 97, he says, Yahweh reigns, let the earth rejoice, let the many islands be glad, clouds of thick darkness surround him. Righteousness and justice are the foundation of his throne. How important is a foundation in a house? Can the house stand without a foundation? And yet you don't see the foundation, right? It's invisible. Our duty, our mandate, and this is what Rico had Genesis 18, verse 19, where Abraham is commissioned to teach his family the way of Yahweh by doing righteousness and justice so that Yahweh may bring about for him all that he's promised, i.e. the land, i.e. the resurrection. Everything with the covenant is tied into righteousness and justice. But what does that mean? We've heard the term, but did you know that other nations knew exactly what righteousness and justice were? Mishum Vikatorum is the Akkadian term, I believe. It's Akkadian or one of the other languages there. They all knew what this was. Whenever a great king would take the throne, he would establish righteousness and justice. This meant releasing the prisoners, righting economic wrongs, cancellation of debts, all of these things. Our king, and what they would do is just like a certain president who may possibly be president right now did, is they would use it to their own political advantage. Because guess what? Kings still had political enemies that might assassinate them. So they would use that to basically take out all of the people who might try to usurp the throne. Our king says, no, we're not going to do that. We're not going to use it for political advantage. We're going to schedule this every 50 years in the Yovel, in the Jubilee. So that's interesting because what we just read, without the shedding of blood, there's no Jubilee. Without the shedding of blood, there's no righteousness and justice. And righteousness and justice was the mark of the great king. Any great king who wanted to be called that, or would be known as a great king, he would establish righteousness and justice. It was something interesting. You know, when Yeshua came on the scene to start saying, I'm the great shepherd, you ever wonder why his disciples didn't start looking around and be like, what are you talking about, man? You don't have a shepherd's crook. You don't have any real sheep behind you. They understood that language. That language, the great king who establishes righteousness and justice, he's called the shepherd. This wasn't something exclusive to the Bible. This was all of these terms. In fact, a lot of the terms that we find attributed, I think Rico mentioned it, the Son of God, that was attributed to every king in the ancient Near East. Does that take away from who Yeshua is? No, because he's also called the Ben Adam, the Son of Man, which is a term of divinity. That's where you get that from Daniel, seeing the Son of Man in the cloud. So that doesn't take away from who Yeshua is. We've got to understand the language of Paul is written in the context of contrasting Yeshua, the real king, versus Caesar, the one who was claiming to be higher than the Olympian gods. Everybody know what the fastest growing religion in the Roman Empire was? Imperial cult. They sacrificed to Caesar. They prayed to Caesar. They sung songs to Caesar. That was the fastest growing religion. So why would Paul be just competing against, nothingness? No, he's writing to people out in, every single one of those letters he wrote was to a powerhouse of Roman imperial cult in its district, right? And so the real ideology he's got to overcome is Caesar's not your God. Caesar, by the way, guess what they called Caesar? Kurios. Anybody know what that word is? Lord. And now Paul is saying Yeshua is Lord. And with this understanding, we can understand verses like Romans 1 verse 4, where it says that through the power of that he was declared the Son of God through the power of the resurrection. I always looked at that growing up. I'm like, how can he be declared the Son of God? Isn't he the Son of God? How can he be declared that? We got to understand the language that Paul is writing in. Not to diminish from Yeshua, but to understand the proper context. That Yeshua is our king, not Caesar, not anyone. All right. Everyone's probably heard that Isaiah 53 is about the nation of Israel, right? We've all heard that argument. Well, I don't need to argue that. I can just go back to the Talmud. This was written 500 years after Yeshua, approximately. But it says, the rabbis said to him, his name is the leper scholar, for as surely it was written, surely he has borne our grief and carried our sorrow, yet we did esteem him a leper, smitten of God and afflicted. What are they quoting there? Isaiah 53. So did the rabbis in the 6th century believe that Isaiah 53 is about the Messiah? Yes. I could also go through and show you other evidence. The Dead Sea Scrolls. It was very clear that there was a large following of people who believed Isaiah 53 was about the Messiah. In fact, what's the movement that they believe in that? Is it Rabbi Nachman? 40% of Judaism believes in Rabbi Nachman. Guess what they attribute Isaiah 53 to? Rabbi Nachman. So don't let people fool you and say, oh, no one ever believed Isaiah 53 was about the Messiah. We need to get over these little anti-missionary blurbs that they like to throw out at us. All right, so let's look at this. Leprosy is very interesting because they use that because your English translations won't say leper there. But we'll talk about why that is. Okay, leprosy. Leprosy is very interesting. First off, we read in Numbers 12, when Miriam is struck with leprosy, that Aaron prays for her and says, let her not be like a stillborn child whose skin is sloughing off. So what's the problem with leprosy? You look like you're dead. If you look at you have this blotchy white skin, you look like what we call today a zombie. You're just not trying to eat someone's brains, right? But it was the walking dead. Now, let me ask you a question. When Adam and Chava sinned and they ate the tree or the fruit, what did they become? They became the walking dead. God said, in that day you will surely die. Not necessarily fall over dead, but they began to die. They began to decay. And so the human mortal condition is akin to leprosy. Okay? Now, the other thing interesting here is the Asham offering. The Asham offering is generally translated as the guilt offering, and you won't read this in the text unless you're actually studying the Hebrew of the text, because it says there's all these sacrifices that you bring, and then it says if you're too poor, there's another list of sacrifices that you bring, but there's one sacrifice you cannot substitute. It's a male lamb. Guess what the male lamb was used for? The Asham offering. Now, there's something else very interesting about that, is that that Asham offering, what they would do is they would take the blood and they would sprinkle it on the altar, and they'd sprinkle some oil on the altar, and then they would take that blood and they would put it on the earlobe and the thumb and the toe of the right side. What that does is it can reconnect someone to the covenant. You notice how many times is blood put on a person in the Torah? Almost never. You have Exodus 24 at Mount Sinai, where Moses takes half the blood, he puts it on the altar, the other half he sprinkles on the people. That creates a ritual connection, a covenant between Yahweh and his people. The other time is when he's doing that to the priest with the earlobe, the thumb, and the toe. He's connecting them to the altar, connecting them to the covenant with the Levites. This leper, this one who was as if they were dead, when they've been healed of that and when they're being restored, they now have to be restored to the covenant. And so this is the only time blood is ever put on an individual after those first two times. Now that's very important because we've all been raised in the tradition, we've been cleansed by the blood of Yeshua. When was the blood of a Passover lamb used to cleanse a person? Never. But it was used in the purification of the leper to cleanse a person. You see, we can't get our minds in this little box with Yeshua and only put him in this one little thing. How many of you agree that Yeshua's death, burial, and resurrection had more than one function? Excellent. We can all agree on that. So I propose to you being washed in Yeshua's blood. These terms of sprinkling of Yeshua's blood are going to tie to leprosy. Before we get into the text, just realize that, and what we're going to see here is my own translation of it based on a lot of research. I took into consideration a lot of other versions. I'm saying this because I've had people go, "You did your own translation? Are you a cult?" And I say, "Yeah, there's Kool-Aid in the back, guys." So this is my own translation. I've taken 3 years of Hebrew in a college setting, but it's also taken into consideration countless translations and commentaries and everything else. We gotta realize, and yes, and our friend, he teaches Hebrew and he verified it and said it's a good translation. Thank you. We know that earlier Israel is defined, the servant is defined as Israel, but when you get to Isaiah 49, it's you can see there's a distinction there. We saw the Talmudic rabbis attribute it to Messiah, and so we can conclude it's clearly speaking of a Messiah, whoever this Messiah is. Isaiah 53 is poetry. So in poetry, guess what they use? They use metaphorical language. And the word choices are going to be very important for us to see why did they choose this word and not that word. And why is that? Because guess what word is not found in the text once? Kippur, atonement. It seems like every Christian versus Jew argument I've heard, the Christianity side, not to put them down because they haven't been taught the cultural context, they're always arguing that it's about atonement. And if it was about atonement, why wouldn't the author of Isaiah have written the word atonement in there one place? We should investigate this, and we will. We also need to know that Isaiah 53's setting is post-exile. Right? Earlier songs clearly mentions King Cyrus. And so the exile, they were shamed, and so they're dealing with intense shame. And so this is God's way of comforting them, how to deal with the shame of exile. So with that in mind, let's get into the text. We're going to start in Isaiah 52. He says, "See," and I want you guys to just look at the language, pay attention to the terms and how many times honor and shame language is used versus sacrificial language. He says, "See, my servant shall prosper and shall be exalted and lifted up and shall be very high." So we see that the end result is that he's going to be exalted and lifted up very high. Remember those little curvy line charts that I made? Which one are we on? We're on the second one where he's going to be lifted up, exalted. We're talking about redemption here. "Just as many who were astonished at him, so marred was his appearance beyond any human semblance and his form beyond any mortal." He's going to be someone shameful. And it was interesting because I saw this video that someone was floating around on YouTube, and they were going, there's these I believe they were Christians. I don't know who they were. They were interviewing Jewish people on the street. How many of you saw this one? And they were having them actually read Isaiah 53 because they never read it. What was interesting is around the 3 to 4 minute mark, this one gentleman, he's like, I see it's about the Messiah, but it's about a Messiah who's going to be shamed. That he's going to be a shameful Messiah. And I was like, that's what we need to be teaching. Because that's what our Messiah went through, is the shame. He was exalted, but during his time here on earth, he was going to be shameful. And we can show this. This was prophesied. There's no doubt in anyone's mind that this text was written prior to Yeshua. So he shall sprinkle many goyim, many nations. Kings shall shut their mouths because of him, for that which has not been told them they shall see, and that which they have not heard they shall contemplate. This word sprinkle here is really interesting. It's the word nazah. The word nazah is found almost exclusively in Leviticus. Sprinkling of blood. By the way, in the purification of the lepers, everyone remember the first day, what do? They take 2 birds, they kill one, they put the blood in the water, they dip the other bird in there, they send that bird off, and then they take that concoction and they sprinkle it on the person to be cleansed. They sprinkle it on that person who's outside of the camp, who's outside of covenant, who's cut off from life. Just like this Messiah, this suffering servant, will sprinkle many goyim, many nations. And by the way, this translation, this is on my website. You can go on there under the resources section, and I have every thing that is different from a normal translation. I have a footnote there to explain why it's there. And so now we get into Isaiah 53. Who has believed what we have heard? And to whom has the arm of Yahweh been revealed? Now this is interesting. This word here for arm is the word Zoroah. And it's a Zion, a Resh, and an Ayin, I believe it is. Now, the normal way it's spelled is Zion, Resh, Vav, Ayin. But here they have what's called a defective Vav. And so the Vav is dropped and they've got this Cholam. They're a little Hebrew lesson, but probably a lot of people don't realize that. But the Nikud, the vowel points that we see in the text, guess when those were added? 800 AD, well after the text. If you go back to original manuals or the oldest manuals, you'll just see line after line of Hebrew words. There's no spaces even. There's no dots. There's nothing there. It's just all consonantal characters. And so it's only by context that we could say that this is the arm of, because anybody else know what Zoroah can mean? Or Zorah? Seed. Spelled exactly the same way as we find it here. So this could also be talking about the seed of Yahweh being revealed. Now I mention that because look at the next verse. For he grew up before him like a young plant. Where does a young plant come from? A seed. I propose to you that the author of Isaiah is making a play on words here. Like a root cut out of the dry ground. He had no form or glory that we should look upon him. Nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. Again, shame. We're dealing with a shameful Messiah. He was dishonored and rejected by others, a man of suffering, acquainted with sickness and disease. And as one from whom others hid their faces, he was dishonored, and we held him of no esteem. So when you're reading this text with someone who's questioning Messiah, we've already seen the rabbis attributed this to Messiah. And so we must be looking for a Messiah who's being rejected, who's being dishonored, who the world thinks, who the religious world thinks especially, is nothing. Now this is interesting here. It says a man of suffering. The word there is makov in the Hebrew. When I was, the first time I was about to teach this at a Sukkot, I think it was a year or two ago, I was translating Exodus 3 for my class, and I came across this verse, and it was really interesting because it all clicked with me. Yahweh said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and I have heard Shema, their cry. So he heard. Remember what Shema means? Not only to hear, but to do something about it. Because of their taskmasters, for I, yada, I know of their sufferings. Is it possible that here Yahweh is hinting at not just he's aware of our sufferings, not just that he was aware of the sufferings of the people in Egypt, but he intimately knew, because he knew what was going to happen to Yeshua, because Yeshua was going to go through the same thing that we did. We look at the life of Yeshua and we think, oh, how horrible was death. Just imagine that. He came down, from whatever position he had on high, he spent 33 years living among us. To me, that's amazing. Can you imagine a king coming down from his palace and saying, I want to live among the commoners. In fact, I don't even want to be even anyone in the commoners. I want to be someone who's shamed. I want to be someone who people despise. That's what our Messiah did for us. Now, this is interesting because right here we've got this, and then I kind of put this, indented this a little bit more because this is looking backwards. So afterwards, they're saying, surely he has carried our sickness and carried our suffering. So they realized this after the fact, but during that fact, what did they think? Yet we had accounted him stricken, struck down by God, and humiliated. So was he struck down by God? No. We accounted him that. We thought that God, let me ask you a question. Do you think the Sadducees thought they were doing the will of God? Absolutely. They thought they were doing what God wanted them to do. We thought that humanity, thought that God struck him down. We thought that God humiliated him. We accounted him, this word here is stricken, that's our word nagah. And if you remember, this is where the Talmud rabbis were quoting. Now, why did they put leper in there? Because this word nagah, translated as stricken, is found almost exclusively in Leviticus 13 and 14. I don't remember the exact numbers, but it's something like 17 out of 20 times it's found in Leviticus 13 and 14. If someone is stricken with leprosy, that's where you see that in context. And so they associate. So now we've just had two terms. We had the sprinkling and we have the stricken that are associated with leprosy. Now, a lot of your translations are going to say, but he was wounded or pierced for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. So what's the question? Why did I translate it that way? Everyone asks me, why did you translate it this way, Ryan? Thank you. Had a couple people listening. Because I translated it from the Hebrew. If we look in the Hebrew, how many of you know a little bit of Hebrew? Okay, so we've got a decent amount. We'll give you a little quick lesson here. This is the word right here. This is the root word pesha. And this new at the end, here this is just us or our. This prefixed word here, this is a mem. A mem is prefixed on there. Whenever you have a word, a letter prefix on there, it's a, I'm blanking on the term. Preposition, thank you. This preposition means from. How many of you heard the song, Mimizrak? Right, that from the east. All of these things. So this, as it's written here, is from our transgressions. If they wanted to say for our transgressions, they would have put a lamed prefix on there. And you can verify this. Go get a JPS Tanakh. They will translate it as because of our transgressions. Does that change a little bit of a perspective on what Isaiah is writing about there? He was wounded because of what we did. We killed him. Just as the disciples were saying, Yeshua whom you crucified, and God raised from the dead. You can also verify that in the Septuagint. The Septuagint uses the word dia. And dia I believe it's in the dative case, it's in a certain case form, and you can verify that also it should be translated as because of. He was wounded because of what we did. Upon him was laid the instruction and the discipline that made us complete, and by his wounds we are healed. Like sheep, we have all gone astray. We have turned our own ways, and Yahweh allowed our iniquity to hurt him. So that word there is in the Hafil case format. I've got that in my translation so you can see why it should be translated as allowed, right? Humanity didn't pull a fast one over God's eyes, right? This was his plan from the beginning. But it doesn't mean that he wanted it. I mean, what he wanted was Adam and Chava to never mess up, right? But because of what we have done, God had to set into motion a plan to redeem us from our own sin. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Do we know anyone who was oppressed and afflicted and didn't say a word? Yeah, we do, right? Now that's something of honor. If you're being tortured and you hold silent, that shows that you are an honorable person, which is kind of interesting. It says, like a lamb that he was led to the slaughter, like sheep before the shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. This word slaughter here, this is not that the Hebrew word there is not found in Leviticus. Now, verse 8, by a what? By a perversion of justice was he taken away. Was justice served when Yeshua was put to death? No, it was a Mickey Mouse kangaroo court. Right? They had to hold it in the middle of the night. Everything about it was wrong. In fact, many people have proposed that if the Sanhedrin would have actually heard about what was going on, they would have put a stop to it. This is not how you do it. It was a perversion of justice. He was completely innocent. Even Pilate, who was well known in other extra-biblical writings to be one of the most wicked guys in the earth. Like Caesar didn't even want to have anything to do with him because he was so just awful. And yet he's like, I wash my hands of this, right? He was like, I have a problem with going on, is how the writers portray it to us. And as for his generation, look at this, who considered that he was cut off out of the land of the living, stricken because of the transgression of my people. Who else was cut off from the land of the living? The leper. So now we see just another term here. And all this stuff with leper, I'm building up to something here for you guys. Don't think I'm just like crazy, just trying to throw something out here. They made his grave with the wicked and his tomb with the rich. Interesting. So he's going to be buried in an honorable place. Although he had done no violence and there was no deceit in his mouth. Yet it was the will of Yahweh to crush him with pain. Now, your versions will say something like, when you make his life a sacrifice for sin or an atonement for sin. Every one of your versions will say that. The problem is guess what that Hebrew word is there? It's our word, asham. That same offering that was vital to the purification of a leper. The only term that's related to a sacrifice in Isaiah 53 is right there. And it's not the word chatat, which would be a sin offering. It's not the word kippur. It's the word asham. You see, we are all in the condition of leprosy. We're all mortal. We're all dying. We all need what? We all need life. We need to be restored to the covenant relationship with Yahweh. And how does that happen? The picture in Leviticus 14 is through the Asham offering. Just like the Babylonian Talmud rabbis said, he was accounted a leper. His coming down and putting on human flesh, guess what? As soon as he put on human flesh, he started to die. He became a leper with us and for us so that he could reconnect us to covenant. He could restore us back to covenant. He shall see his offspring and prolong his days. Everyone recognizes that there's death, and yet he'll prolong his days, which must mean resurrection. All right? Out of his anguish he shall see the light, and he shall find satisfaction through his knowledge. The righteous one, the tzaddik, my servant, shall make many righteous. Isn't this what Paul talks about all the time? He's obsessed with righteousness, right? And in fact, every time you see the word justification, that's from the same word, the dikaiosine root. Justification and righteousness, to justify someone, means to declare them right, in the right. And yours will say he'll bear many sins. That word there is nasa, and nasa is translated throughout the Torah as to forgive. The priests literally bear away the sins of Israel. And so he will forgive their iniquities. Therefore, I will allot him a portion with the great. So he was shamed. He's going to be risen to a place of honor. And he shall divide the spoils with the strong, because he poured out himself to death and was what? Numbered with the transgressors. You see, Moses once prophesied that there was going to arise a prophet like Moses, right? Enrico has a great teaching. Eddie, I think you have some teachings on this as well, about all the connections between Yeshua and Moses. Let me ask you a question. When Moses was on the mountain and God was going to wipe out all of Israel because of the sin of the golden calf, if Moses, all he had to do is just said, okay, would Moses have made it to the promised land? Yes, he would have, right? Because he wouldn't have had those 10 spies to bring back a bad report. In fact, he probably could have made it there within a week. It wasn't that far away. God said he was going to start over with him. So we wouldn't be known as the sons of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We'd be known as the sons of Moses. How honorable would that be for Moses? He would be the most renowned man in the world, probably. If he would have just said, he didn't even have to say anything. He just stood there. I don't know, God. Just do whatever you want to. Right? That's all he had to do. But what was Moses' primary concern? Was it for his own honor? Was it for his own life? No. He said, what will the nations say if you destroy your people? That would bring shame to God's name. And I propose to you that Yeshua is doing the same thing. That he was more concerned. He could have come down and called down a host of angels, wiped out Caesar. That's what they were expecting him to do, right? But what would have made him any different from Caesar? Controlling the world through force. No, Yeshua, just like Moses said, what will the nations think if I just come down and destroy everything? What will they think about you? No, instead, I'm going to allow myself, because did Moses make it to the promised land? No, Moses died with his people. He was numbered with the transgressors. Not only did he die with them, but he suffered with them for 40 years. I can't imagine being the leader of those people, right? He suffered with them for 40 years in the desert. Yeshua didn't come down and conquer the earth right away. He suffered with us for 30 years, and then he died, as we just saw, with us. See, we still suffer. We still die. But we have perfect faith because Yeshua has already come down. He's already shown that he can go through suffering. He can go through death, and God has the power to resurrect him from the dead. Amen? It says, and yet he forgave the sins of many and made intercession for the transgressors. Father of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, our God and our King, I want to thank you on this day we're worshiping you, we're celebrating that you are the King of the universe, that you are the one who is righteous, that you hold true to your covenant promises, that you will do whatever is necessary, including sending your own son to suffer with us, to be a leper with us, and to die with us, in order that every name, as we know coming nearer to us in the future, every name will confess Yeshua as our master, and all of that will be to the glory of you, our Father and our King. I pray that everyone here received some bit of knowledge that will help them and be a blessing to them. And if there's anything that I said that was troubling to them, may it fall on deaf ears for them, Father. In Yeshua's name we pray. Amen. Amen.
talked last week about the dangers of sugar, how really bad it's for us. And I wanted people to know that there is an alternative. High fructose corn syrup, since it was introduced in the 70s, there's been a huge rise of obesity. Uh, in fact, obesity has tripled. And that's the one thing that took place there, that a lot of people are attributing the obesity rate being so bad. And more people have come down with diabetes and stuff. So it's really, um, you know, a real problem out there. But anyway, there are some things that they have come out with that are really, really good. And one thing that I found, and this is me personally, are what called konjac noodles, Konjac, or shiitake noodles, they call them in some places. But it's made from the konjac root, which is an Asian herb that grows in Asia. It's also known as glucomannan. That's Glucom as in man, Annan. And there was a company that started Miracle Noodles. It started making this herb into the shape of noodles. And they're essentially 97% water and 3% soluble fiber. They're soy-free, gluten-free, cholesterol-free, non-GMO ingredients. And they have different kind of pasta shapes. I usually, when I get their brand, I usually only get the angel hair because it's because of this consistency and texture. I like the thinner noodles. When I found this product 3 or 4 years ago, I just started, putting it into my diet. When somebody else would have spaghetti, I would have their noodles. And then I went to my doctor, and they did my my blood sugar had dropped significantly, and my cholesterol had dropped significantly. So there is the Miracle Noodle, which I don't have a picture of. And then there is also Trim Healthy Mama. And I know a lot of people have heard about Trim Healthy Mama. And they also make a version of the konjac noodles. And it comes in a package like this. Now, since they came out with this, I kind of personally, and I kind of hate to say this because Miracle Noodles is really good, but I like their brand better just personally because they add oat fiber to it, and it makes it not as chewy. I like the consistency and the texture of this one better, but it's just whatever, suits your texture. Okay. And then there's also something you can add, PGX Daily. These are PGX. Yes, that's very good, Mark. Thank you. This is PGX Daily. It's a granulated konjac noodle that you add to water and you can drink it. So when I'm on the go and I can't take the noodles out, a lot of times I'll have these in my purse, and before I'll eat, I'll put them in water and drink it. That's another thing. And I'm doing this to lower my blood sugar, lower my cholesterol. All right. Then Miracle Noodles also they have come out in the last, year and a half or so, or maybe been before that, of these. This is one thing. It's called Smart Buns. And they're buns, like sometimes you just get tired of doing without bread, okay? These are buns. I got sesame seeds on them. If you don't want the sesame seeds, you can tell them you don't want the sesame seeds. But they're 72 calories, gluten-free, non-GMO, 10 grams of protein per bun, and 12 grams of fiber. And they have it says 0 carbs. That's right. See there? 0 carbs. 0 carbs. When I really want like a sandwich or something, then I'll use this. They also have a thing called smart cakes. They're little smart cakes, gluten-free. They have them in lemon and vanilla latte, chocolate, and cinnamon. And I use these as like a little dessert, or like in the morning, if I don't have time to eat or something, then I'll grab one of these. Now they are small. They come two in a package, and they're about that big around and about that tall. And I'll eat both of them in the package if I'm eating them for breakfast when I'm running on the go. But the thing of it is, like, if I want a little something sweet, I'll take like one of the vanilla ones and crumble it up in a bowl, and then I'll either put some two or three chopped strawberries on top of it, and then put whipping cream. And I don't buy the whipping cream or the Cool Whip. I whip my own cream with the extra whipping cream, the real stuff you get. And then another thing, this is really cool. I found this out from Trim Healthy Mama. I'll take some cream, some of that heavy whipping cream, and put maybe a little less than maybe a fourth of a cup in a jar, and add some chocolate to it, the non-alkalized cocoa powder, and a little of their gentle sweet. It's called gentle sweet sweetener. And then I'll put the top on the lid, and I'll sit there and shake it and shake it and shake it, and it makes a chocolate whipping cream. It makes a chocolate whipped cream. So I'll put it on top of one of those little cakes. It's actually they use it as in Trim Healthy Mama, they use it as a chocolate icing. So it gives you a chance to have that. And I didn't put the gentle sweet. I wanted to say something about that. There is a sweetener that you use for them, and I use personally, this is all my personal thing, okay? I use their gentle sweet, and it's a non-GMO xylitol, a non-GMO erythritol, and an organic stevia extract powder that's all mixed together. And that's what I use as my sweetener, and it doesn't raise my blood sugar, but it gives me that, it does sweeten things. And, I would say this too, the Trim Healthy Mama cookbook that they have. Now, Trim Healthy Mama, I think their premise is you don't eat fats and you don't eat carbs together. But the Trim Healthy Mama cookbook is got some really good things in there. And, I don't know if y'all noticed it, but have you noticed where they've had a lot of cauliflower, riced cauliflower, and pizza crust cauliflower made out of cauliflower now? Well, that all came from Trim Healthy Mama. They have a recipe that you can make pizza crust with cauliflower and mozzarella cheese that they have. And I think you can just go to their website and even just get that one. They used to have it out there just on their website, but it's in their cookbook, and you make that. And I made it and our son lives with us, and of course I just gave him, I didn't say anything, I just gave it out to him. Later on I asked him, I said, well, how'd you like that pizza? He said, oh, it was good. And I said, well, what'd you think of the cauliflower crust? And he's like, what do you mean the cauliflower crust? He didn't even notice the difference. So there are things out there that they even have candies and cakes you can make. You just you have to do what's right for your body. Okay. So there's a lot of things, a lot of really good recipes that I've gotten from them, and helps keep that blood sugar under control so that I don't have to, I'll tell you what, insulin will cause you to gain weight when you get on it a lot of times. And, if we can get these things under control and kind of check out of, get out of the food systems that causes us to eat all this sugar, and go to the alternatives. And I'm not talking about the stuff that's bad for us. I'm talking about like the stevia and the natural plant things. Monk fruit is another one that they use a lot in their recipe. I think they put monk fruit in one of the smart cakes, I believe. But that's another sweetener. So we're learning as we go along, these things. And I just wanted to put that out there that, we know we're learning the dangers of sugar. And then for those of us that have sugar problems, these are very, very helpful. These like these PGX dailies and you know, the noodles, the Trim Healthy. In fact, they have a Trim Healthy Mama rice, you know, and I had that last night. We have our cousins here, and we had red beans and rice last night, and I had red beans over Trim Healthy Mama rice that they have. So there's a lot of things out there.
Two real quick questions. Number one, the konjac noodles that you were talking about before, do they taste good? And secondly, how expensive is this stuff? Just real quick.
The konjac, they don't really have a taste. So whatever you put them in, they pick up that flavor. And like I said, the issue I had with like they make it in the linguine and the fettuccine and all that, I don't like because they're kind of, I hate to use the word, but they're a little bit rubbery. These are not, the Trim Healthy Mama are not like that. There's a difference, but both of them are good products. The Smart Cakes, I think they're expensive, but when I'm looking around and everybody around me is having strawberry shortcake that I can't have, then I'll spend that little extra money to have that on hand to keep me from giving into the temptation of the flesh to eat that strawberry shortcake.
Right.
I can have this as a substitute. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And it's way, I was thinking about it. I said, it's way cheaper than having to go on the meds and stuff that they have for diabetes, because that stuff is expensive. So, it helps. It's just some helps I put out there. And
sounds good. Well, thank you, Sherry. Hey, thank you, Mark, for getting the website up there.
You bet. I'll skip 3 meals just to have strawberry shortcake.
Yum. Yeah, I love strawberry shortcake. So
that's what I do. I use that little vanilla one. I crumble it up and then put the fresh cut strawberries on. Oh, and I put I use the Gentle Sweet and then the real whipping cream. You buy that Cool Whip and stuff, and that ain't good for you. I just get the whipping cream, and you can just shake it in a jar like this. We used to make butter that way. When we had goat's milk in a jar, we'd shake it till the butter came to the top.
Very cool. Well, thank you, Sherry, for that health segment.
We are richly blessed to bring you what we believe is the fullest, most diverse, yet up-to-date progressive teachings, discussion, and prayer programming you can find anywhere on this planet. Be sure to take the tour of the MessianicLambRadio.com website. I'm Susan Hoogie, thanking you for joining us on the Messianic Lamb Video Network. Richly blessed to bring you what we believe is the fullest, most diverse, yet up-to-date progressive teachings, discussion, and prayer programming you can find anywhere on this planet. Be sure to take the tour of the MessianicLambRadio.com website. I'm Susan Hoogie, thanking you for joining us on the Messianic Lamb Video Network.